Negative, Major Tom. Negative. It is imperative that you remain in the capsule. Oh boy, there you go.
It is the distant future, the year 2000.
Houston, we have a podcast.
To be fair, we normally just kind of like naturally go into it, and that's that. But now we're just sitting here with our minds a little blank. Welcome to the Sad Boys Book Club. My name's Dusty,
And I'm Daniel.
and we were too poor to come up with an intro this week. So Leviathan Wakes Part 2.
Yep, Leviathan Wakes Part 2. So, I don't know, how are you feeling about the book so far?
This is one of the best books I've read in the last 10 years.
Wow.
Which I realize
High praise.
Yeah, I mean, if you go off of, you know, some of the things I said in the very first episode of the podcast about how I haven't really read much since like 2017, that may not sound like a lot of praise, but like, I don't know. I've listened to a lot of audiobooks, but I've also read a handful of books in 10 years, and this is one of the better ones. Oh my god, I love this book.
Yeah, it's a very good book. I've liked it so far. I might not be at that quite the level that you're at, but you know, I've enjoyed it quite a bit. I think the world building is, you know, like I said the other day, it's very good, very interesting, and to me, I think that's where the book is shining, and I guess the plot is really good too. But those elements are. That's kind of like how I said the first time around. Those two things are shining, and I'm starting to warm up to the characters a bit too, particularly Holden and his crew.
Yeah, I said this to you off camera earlier, but I feel like it demands repeating. I feel like in this section we covered, which was approximately the next 100 pages, we didn't get a lot of plot progression, but we got a lot of character progression.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. I mean, there's some big plot moments that we'll hop into here in just a bit, but I think this is mostly like if the first 100 pages, because that was roughly what we read the first time around, it was almost like a hook, and this is kind of like okay, you're settling in for the ride, and you're like they gave you like the overarching. What each character is about during that first 100 pages, but this is, like you're saying, they spend a lot of time developing them here.
Yeah. I feel like in terms of, like, major plot points, there isn't too much to say outside of the Donnager.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, Miller's story, it's a lot of, like, more of the same, which I'm totally okay with, because he's got that really fun, like, kind of almost noir thing going on. With the Julie Mao investigation and the threat of war with Mars going on in the belt, and the tumultuous unease that has been caused in the belt because of that. So that's all still kind of there, and that's all still building and building and building. And I feel like we've kind of like, I feel like we've hit the start of the bubble burst for that tension by the time we finished the section we were on. So I feel like, once again, we're at a point to where we have stopped on the cusp of the next major thing in the book. So that's fun.
Yeah, it is. I like how we've broken it out so far.
Yeah. This is such a fun book, and I feel like I'd like to think that Frank and Abraham, or Corey, or however you want to refer to them, had a lot of fun writing this book, because there is so much in here where I'm just reading it and I just kind of stop and I look at it and I'm like, man, that was a really fun sentence, or like a really fun paragraph, where I just read it and I have to go back and read it again and I'm like, man, that was just cool. There was one that stood out to me. It was, I think, a Miller one. Yeah, it was. It was when I think it was in the last Miller chapter that we read, when he lets his alarm go off for 10 minutes straight before getting up and getting ready for the day, and he's just kind of like mulling it, like the situation over in his head, and just thinking, oh well, everybody thinks that I'm a deadbeat piece of shit cop that sucks now, and I guess this is just me living up to that reputation. And then there's the passage where he turns off his alarm. Let me actually. My book was behind me on the bed, not on my desk, so I had to really lean for it.
Sure.
Let me find the actual passage so I can read it, because I'm not going to do it justice by paraphrasing.
There's another one while you're looking for it that really shone to me. It was okay, yeah. 2 hours later, Miller finished the last of the paperwork and sent Dowd off to the cells. 3.5 hours later, the first of his docking requests came in. 5 hours later, the government of Ceres collapsed. I thought I was like, man, bars. That was a really nice little paragraph.
Yeah, that's another really good one. I think another really good one is the one talking about how Shed died and how sudden it was, and it just feels so kind of matter of fact, and it kind of like and then this happened, and it's something that's supposed to be really big.
Sure. And
it's told in such a matter of fact, almost emotionless kind of way, and it's crazy. It's how it does, how it almost makes it hit harder. I have an equivalent, and this is a spoiler for something else that I'm kind of questioning whether or not I should even mention. Granted, this spoiler is like almost 10 years old now, and it's an Attack on Titan.
I mean, I'm never going to watch that show, so feel free to make your analogy, but be forewarned if you are an Attack on Titan curious person.
Yeah, so this would be a spoiler for, like, I didn't watch the show. I read it, so I don't know where it would be in the show. My guess would be like season 3, maybe season 2. I don't know. I didn't watch the show, but it's still somewhat early on, and okay. I'll say this for anybody that might be curious but also don't want to be spoiled to something that's almost a decade old at this point. It's when you learn the identity of the Colossus Titan and the Armored Titan. I think that's what it's been a long time. I think that's what they were called. That's what I'm talking about. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 spoilers. So when you learn that Bertold and Reiner are the Colossus Titan and the Armored Titan, it's there's like stuff going on in the scene, and people are having their conversation, and some big thing just happened. And in one of the panels, in the background of the panel, you see the two of them talking to Aaron, and there's just a little speech bubble, and Reiner's just like, Aaron, Berthold and I are the Armored Titan and the Colossus Titan. And it's just, like I said, it's in the background of a panel. And I stared at it for like a good 2 or 3 minutes, and I'm like, what? That what? So like Shed's death kind of reminds me of something like that, to where it's just kind of done in such a way that you're just like, wait, what? And you just have to look at it a couple of times, and you're like, is that really what's going on right now? Yeah,
I definitely had to not flip back, but like go back and reread that again, because it was just so very suddenly done and without a lot of ceremony. But I think there is a certain craft to that, the way that he wrote that, or they, I guess, wrote that, that it's the sort of the reality of the thin membrane between life and death when it comes to things like that. It's like 1 second he was there, and then he was not, and mechanically, it's just, even though there's great significance to a person and about that event, I guess when you're looking at sort of the cosmic scale, as you often do in things like sci-fi, it is just like another thing that's happening,
Yeah. I don't want to come across as saying that I was complaining about how that was written. It's completely the opposite. I think it is just such a... It's a very surgical way of doing it, and I feel like I think I said this a minute ago, it adds impact at the same time because of how emotionless it comes across. It's almost just kind of like an extra hit on top of the fact that you're seeing a character who you've gotten to know at this point die suddenly, and it's like, oh shit, okay. But to round it back around, I have the quote here ready. If you want some reference here, it's on page 184. Okay. This is Miller. It says, he reached over and turned off the alarm. Just before it cut off, he heard a voice in it, soft but insistent, a woman's voice. He didn't know what she'd been saying, but since she was just in his head, she'd get another chance later.
Yeah, that was really good too.
Yeah, that's a really cool passage because it's a nice kind of look into Miller's psyche without going into Miller's psyche. It's just one of those nice subtle. It's a book equivalent of Show Don't Tell.
Yeah, and like I think you had a very apt comparison with that sort of like likening it to like noir film, or I guess the literary equivalent of the hard-boiled detective fiction, the kind of Raymond Chandler-esque style of writing kind of thing that going on there.
Yeah, and it's like we're supposed to we're following Miller. He's a very likable character. And I love how you have this kind of, up until the last couple of chapters of his that we've read, he kind of has this kind of gravitas around him to where you know that he's good at his job, you know that he cares about his job. But like looking back in hindsight, there are little hints here and there about how his reputation actually is in Star Helix. But then when you really get it with after Havelock leaves with the transfer, not with the transfer, it's he calls him and says, hey, there's a good chance you could be killed at any point in time just for being an Earther. You need to leave now. So Havelock just gets out, and he's partnered up with some woman named Muss. And we learn that he is not he's not hot shit anymore. He's the person that when someone is being punished, they're partnered up with him. When there's a case that nobody wants, he's the one that gets it. And he is having that realization when Muss says it to him as well. So, like I said, I feel like there were some nice little snippets before that kind of was painting that picture if you really were trying to look for it. But if you were just kind of along for the ride, it was just, maybe a little bit of a surprise. And it was interesting because I feel like with standard noir, you do have that hard-boiled, down-on-his-luck detective that's really, really competent and really good at his job, but maybe he has his vices that is stopping him from reaching his full potential. But this one case comes around, and that's what kind of gets him back in his swing of things, and he becomes a better detective than he's ever been, or he just fails spectacularly, and it's a tragedy as well. But I feel like this does kind of have some roots in classic noir, and it feels like it's almost kind of shutting down some cliches at the same time, because while Miller is a competent detective, and he does care, at least about Julie Mao, to the point to where I do believe what he says when he's talking to, was it Anderson Dawes? Is that his name? The OPA guy?
OPA guy?
Is it Anderson Dawes?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think so.
Okay, I can remember.
His last name was Dawes. Because there's like the other OPA guy. Is his name Fred Anderson?
It's Fred Johnson.
Fred Johnson. That's right. I was just.
But he was the butcher of Anderson Station.
That's what it was.
Yeah, that's why I was kind of confused. I was like, am I remembering right? His name was Anderson Dawes because Anderson Station. Like, I don't know if it was just one of those things. Because I know in books you tend to not want to name people the same thing. Like. In our real world, how many Daniels are there? How many Michaels are there? How many Jerrys are there? All this stuff. Like, I went to school with someone whose name was also Dustin, and we were in the same grade. Like, it's we have common and similar names. But if you're writing fiction, while it might make sense that there are two characters with the same name that are living in close proximity to each other, because that's just how naming conventions go, it doesn't read well when you have that, because if you have two Marks in your story, then it's going to get confusing. So I guess the point is, I'm wondering if Anderson Dawes, if his name being Anderson has any relevance to Anderson Station. Maybe this is me just trying to find a thread where there isn't one. but normally when there's someone sharing a name with something, it is intentional in novels, like I said, because if you just have people having the same names, it gets confusing.
I think there's something, that's not necessarily a bad supposition. I think that's something that, I don't know, maybe we can watch as the novel goes along and see if that ever comes back around, because you do have also the both of those characters, Anderson Dawes and Fred Johnson, the butcher of Anderson Station. They're both related to the OPA, so I don't know, maybe there's some sort of connection there that's going to become more apparent. One other last thing before you move on here, what you were talking about, how in retrospect, some of the things that Miller does, you realize, for kind of you're looking at Miller for who he actually is. When he was going to Julie Mao's apartment, and he was like hacking into her computer and all that stuff. Remember how he was like, he goes into her fridge and like grabs a beer?
Yeah.
I thought that was just like that struck me as being weird at the time, but I figured that it was just the author's like, I don't know, are they trying to make him seem kind of weird and quirky or something? I don't know, maybe something like that. But when it comes into the reality of like, oh, this guy's just an alcoholic, that's it's like, okay, that puts that in a whole new kind of relief there,
Yeah. But what do you think? I guess I kind of lost the point I was trying to make when we went on the tangent about Andersons. So I can't remember where I was going with that. So I'll have to either come back to it or just drop it. What do you think about Anderson Dawes as of right now?
I don't know. Generally pro Anderson Dawes. He seems like a sensible guy, trying to do right by, the Belter people. I don't know. Maybe a little bit shady. They might be trying to like. This might be one of those things where you're like not sure what his character is, and he's kind of like he seems vaguely good, but there's like a little bit, because there is something a little bit, I don't want to say off about him necessarily, but there's something about him that's a little bit, I don't know.
There's something under the surface that you feel like hasn't come up yet, but is going to be something that might influence your opinion on him, possibly in the negative.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. I mean, but that's kind of his thing. He's kind of having to operate in this sort of like shadow space of being like I don't want to say shadow government, but like a separate, like he represents a group of people that are, they're not, by their very nature, they have their work is somewhat clandestine. So
would you say,
obviously go ahead.
Would you say that the OPA are kind of performing a soft coup right now?
So I guess to give context to that, as the things are kind of unfolding, and as we see stuff play out in the Holden story, we see that the Earth government is basically pulling out of its backing on the Ceres Station. So that was something I wasn't actually aware of at the time. I mean, I knew that that their company was an Earth concern, but I wasn't aware that, I guess that meant that they were following Earth rules. I figured that it was just like pretty much a pure sort of like company town where basically only company rules apply. But I guess that wasn't the case. But anyway, so as the things are happening in the Holden storyline, we see that the government of Ceres, as I mentioned before, has basically fallen apart, and then now that there's a provisional government has taken over control of the station, and that they seem to be in talks with the OPA. Now, as far as to whether I think the OPA necessarily organized this, I'm inclined to say no. I'm inclined because I think when we hear from another OPA figure, he seems to be pretty adamant about like trying to avoid conflict, and I think the OPA taking power on the station would only be more fuel for the conflict. But on the other hand, they're kind of in between a rock and a hard place, where they can't really just leave the power vacuum, you know. So I think they're just kind of taking advantage of the situation, and they realize it's an opportunity for them to gain sort of influence, and like they say in the book, there's like thousands and thousands of craft coming in and out of Ceres Station every day. So there's probably like a lot of money involved there, and there's a lot of people that are sympathetic to the Belter cause. So I just think it's sort of like a natural thing that they're like, okay, well, if Earth's pulling out, then yeah, we're gonna go ahead and try to use this for what it's worth.
Yeah, which maybe I should clarify what I meant by soft coup, because you know we had the bit. I think it was at the end of the Miller chapter from where we left off in the first part covering this, where he said, "Oh, the OPA isn't trying to take over the criminal organization; they're trying to take over the police organization." That I guess that's kind of what I mean with the soft coup comment, to where they're not trying to necessarily take complete and total control over the station as a whole and be the main governing force of it. More so, they're trying to. Do you think they're trying to at least take a somewhat substantial control over some of the more, not political, but more on the ground aspects of the station, to have control over it in that regard, so that they have more power over, I guess, the people in a more localized fashion and not in a political fashion? And not control, like, reigning over them with an iron fist, but more so... Because I do think at least the OPA, the way that Dawes sees it, sees themselves as kind of the Robin Hood and his merry men kind of group, to where they're looking out for the Belters, and they're just trying to make sure that everybody lives fairly and adequate. Well, maybe more than adequately. Like, you know, everybody is happy, healthy, and living their best life. And they don't think that rules under Earth or Martian laws help them achieve that. So they have that kind of, not necessarily anarchistic output, but more, I don't want to say revolutionary either, because I don't think Dawes wants war. I think it's been made pretty clear that Dawes, and Johnson as well, I would think that those two are part of the same OPA faction. Where they don't want war. They want peace but freedom.
Well, yeah, they definitely represent a certain self-determinative view about for the Belters, and it's kind of like we were saying in the first episode. You know, we can see that the Belt is, you know, things are not really going so good for the Belters under the rule of like Mars and Earth. You know, they're not really, I mean, some people are living pretty well, but like for the vast majority of people, they are not really doing much more than just kind of scraping by, you know.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see that in like the when they give descriptions of the station, like the kind of crimes that they have, you know, that they've talked about. They're all crimes that are very that are indicative of like an economic desperation, you know. That's sort of like, well, you know, it's just, there's just like a lot of, it's just not a good situation for the Belters. And I think what the OPA is trying to do is, one, I think part of the reason Dawes, we one of the times we see Dawes, he's at first trying to influence Miller to stop looking into the Julie Mao case, because, you know, he doesn't really give too much of a reason at first, but he does seem to be like wanting to work with Miller. So he's like, you know, he's trying to offer him a deal. He's like, okay, well, if you stop looking into the Julie Mao case, I can give you some information that helps you solve the case of the missing riot gear. and that's that kind of stuff. Like he's trying to do like a quid pro quo thing. And the second time we see him after Miller, Miller kind of seems like he's going along with it, and they kind of part on good terms. And then immediately Miller goes behind the back of both Dawes and his superior, Shahid, or Shadid. Her name's Shadid, I think.
I think I'm not perfect on how to pronounce it.
And then she, and he tries to contact Julie's family directly via some sort of like communication network. And what we see the next day is that his boss intercepted the communication, which is kind of interesting that they did that. It does kind of show kind of one thing I've kind of thought about as we've read a lot of this book to this point, is that the security forces and the governor, maybe not necessarily the governor directly, although likely, but the government of the station is pretty, I guess I would say, sort of totalitarian. They're very they're monitoring people's communications and trying to make sure it doesn't seem like there's any kind of there's not a lot of civil rights on the station, for example. And so they intercept his communication before it even goes out, and they prevent him from contacting Julie's parents. And anyway, that's when she brings him in to talk about it. Dawes is also there, and they're kind of giving him a little bit of a good cop, bad cop, if you'll pardon the pun, kind of routine.
Yeah, and something I found interesting about that bit is through body language and kind of how the conversation goes, it seems like Dawes has some sort of superiority over Shadid, which I found interesting. It just kind of shows that whether or not this OPA takeover of Star Helix, or at least the policing body of the station, is new or not, their hooks are in deep enough to where it's already kind of a done deal. The OPA is at least is in the hierarchy, is above even Star Helix right now.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because if you think about it, the OPA is a body that represents like numerous stations, and like they're on a lot of different stations. They're on different. They're probably also on the outposts on different like moons and planets. Whereas this is just a local security force, so that when it comes to if we're just looking at this as like just based on who is more powerful than the other, and we're making determinations just based on that, I think it's pretty clear, at least to me, that the OPA has a lot more muscle behind them, and therefore, even though their intentions and here to this point seem to be benign or positive, like that they are. I think there is a certain sort of like that we're kind of putting our foot down here, and we want you to stop looking into the case because and this is something that he says after Miller kind of has like a little back and forth with his boss, and it's kind of gets a little heated, but Dawes is like, okay, look, I think we're kind of going off on the wrong foot here. Like we need you to stop looking into this case because it would be more damaging to the. I was gonna say geopolitical, but we're not geo. We're like in a galaxy. It would be better for the political situation between the Belt and Mars if we're able to just handle this. Is basically his assertion.
Yeah, which I think I don't necessarily disagree with his point. Like because his reasoning is that since Miller works for the Star Helix, which is essentially run by Earth, that anything he discovers, anything that he makes official, is going to go through the channels back to Earth and could cause the current Mars and belt crisis to spiral out of control even further, which, granted, I feel like that ends up becoming irrelevant once Earth backs out of when the United Nations back out of Ceres Station, and just kind of say, well, you're on your own, guys. So because when he gets pulled back into her office and Dawes is there again at the end of the chapter when he gets fired, Dawes is there and he does not look fun. Like he is visibly distressed, and Miller makes a mental note that I think Miller makes a mental note that this was the worst outcome that this was the worst possible outcome that Dawes saw, because the whole thing was basically being contingent on Earth staying neutral, because that was their only way of being able to actually try and do some sort of possibly peaceful containment of the situation, because if Earth picks a side, then that just complicates everything.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I don't know if this is necessarily Earth taking a side. Like, maybe this is something that was a pro-Mars move, maybe. But maybe this was also just a, look, we are not going to take a side here. We are going to go so far as to just completely remove ourselves from the situation entirely. Congratulations, you're all on your own. We're just going to stand here in the corner, plug our ears, and scream la 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 over and over, so you guys have fun doing what you're doing. Like, that, it could be that, or it could be them taking a Mars side. I feel like we might get a little more later on as to what that was specifically. But all the same, Belt's in a bad place, I think, right now.
Yeah. And, I can understand from the Earth perspective wanting to get it out of this conflict, because I think, and this is something we can touch on later when we get back to the other storyline, but they explain very clearly how this could very easily spiral out into like a almost potentially species annihilating battle, and that would be, I can understand from that perspective, Earth just being like, okay, look, just doing some like a just raw self-interest determinated thinking here, and just saying, look, this is not looking good. If it comes to war between these two groups and they get desperate enough, they really could do some major damage. And if we get involved in that, we could also kind of get caught up in the backlash. So it may just be better for us, and and maybe even the potential survival of humanity, to just take a step back and just try to stay out of it as much as we can.
Yeah, Johnson does reference the famous Einstein quote that if you've ever played a Call of Duty game, you've probably seen.
Only if you're bad at the game.
Only if you're bad at the game, yes. I'm probably going to be paraphrasing this. It's something like, I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Something like that. I don't know if it was sticks and stones. I think it was with rocks, but that's the point. The
point still stands. Yeah. So Johnson makes a reference to that quote when Holden and the crew make it to Tycho Station later on. But one thing.
Well, I think it was kind of a double entendre, because he means literally, like, yes, they are rocks, but they're weaponizing. They're talking about potentially weaponizing asteroid strikes.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Like, that has the potential to wipe out the species. So that's probably a good reason why Earth is just like, you know what, we need to get out of this conflict, as because there's just too much at stake.
Yeah, that's a terrifying thought. Because he says that they can essentially strap rockets onto asteroids and send them to the surface of Mars, and he says that they could turn the surface of Mars into essentially a magma crater, which is just an insane thing to think about. And it's like, yeah, that's a very it feels like a very apocalyptic endgame kind of thing. A real world equivalent would be having a fuck it, we're just gonna nuke our enemy kind of mentality, because if you do something like that, Like that's breaking the seal. If the OPA and the Belters just went scorched Mars with asteroids, then the Martians would definitely respond by nuking everything on the belt. And yeah, while Earth may technically be left standing, which granted is the largest population hub of humanity still, it might potentially devastate the entire ecosystem, if that makes sense. The entire ecosystem of the solar system. Because
it's going to do that. It would also crash the economy, you know.
Yeah, and you even have because there's the outer planets too. You have the outer 4 planets, and we haven't really seen much in the way of how their economy and their culture is compared to the belt and the inner planets. But we do know that they are a thing. They are a faction that still exists out there. There's people out in Neptune. There's people out in Saturn. Maybe not on like Saturn or Jupiter, because like, you know, Jupiter's a gas giant. But even still, you have the rings of Saturn, or where they get the ice for the icebergs for the hauling crews. You have Io, Europa, Callisto, all those moons. I'm gonna look at here. Titan is one of them, I think. Yeah, so you have like all those moons that, at the very least, are inhabitable to a point to where they can be used in a economic standpoint. But something I've noticed, if you open up your little handy dandy map, it makes it a point to point out Titania on Uranus, which makes me feel like even all the way out in Uranus, there's still some form of civilization. So if you have a situation where even if the Earth survives, but Mars and the Belt are just decimated by this war, I feel like all those outer planets are going to be suffering from it long term as well, because how do you continue to provide and establish contact with people so far out when the space in between is possibly going to be at worst an irradiated no-fly zone, and at best a wasteland?
Yeah, and that's the thing too. You know, how do those places they get resupplied? You know, because that they'd have to be coming, all those supplies would have to be coming from Earth at that point, and there probably would need to be like way stations, and that's one of the things that's so important about the asteroid belt. There is like it works as like a good like hub for commerce and shipping and all of that. And so if that's all gone because of the war, those places don't get resupplied, or if they do, it takes a lot longer, and they're in a world of hurt. You know, they may not be able to be resupplied, and they may just die a terrible lingering death, freezing in the deep void of space.
Yeah, the belt isn't necessarily a geographic halfway point, but it's almost like a metaphorical halfway point between the inner and outer planets. I mean, it is a physical barrier that separates the first 4 and the back 4 planets.
Yeah, definitely.
But one last thing I want to point out with Dawes before moving on completely, and this is completely irrelevant to the book, but I learned, because my brother watched the show, and he loved the show. He hasn't read the books, but I'm telling him, I'm like, dude, you need to read the books. They're great. He told me that, and I looked and I confirmed this myself, Dawes is played by Jared Harris in the show.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Jared Harris is a great actor.
Yeah, I love seeing him in things. I feel like he's one of those like super underrated actors that is way better than what he's given credit for. Though I haven't seen Chernobyl yet, and I've heard it's fantastic, and I've been wanting to watch it since it came out. I just haven't. And 2, I've heard he's amazing in it, and I'm like, well, yeah, he's amazing in everything, so I would expect that already. Shout out to my boy Lane Price, the best character in Mad Men.
Yeah, he was great in that show. He was that was probably when he first came to my attention as an actor. But you know, that's really good casting. I think he really does fit the role of Dawes. You know, because he can do that sort of like warm, convivial, like gentle positiveness, but there's like something a little bit under the surface that's a little bit seamy. There's something a little bit strange there that you're like, I don't know if I want to poke this, you know.
Yeah, Which, to give you another kind of comparison of his filmography, that could go toward that statement you made is he plays Moriarty in Sherlock Holmes: Game of Shadows, the second Robert Downey Jr. one.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a great Moriarty, by the way. I only saw that movie once in theaters, way back when it first came out. But I loved him as Moriarty. I was like, man, he just perfectly hits that menacing, conniving, and super clever, albeit not necessarily the most physically imposing kind of villain, which I think is important for what Moriarty is. Which is why I very, very much prefer the Jared Harris Moriarty to the, I don't know the actor's name, but the guy that played him in the BBC show, the Benedict Cumberbatch Moriarty. Which, no shade against him, he did a phenomenal job. The Moriarty in that show is really good too, and that actor did a fantastic job with it. But I feel like Jared Harris kind of conveyed that cunning, conniving, and super imposing, even if not physically imposing, part of the role that I think was missing in the show, which is more to do with the writing and not the acting.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. We should think about doing a Sherlock Holmes book in the future.
I've never read one actually, but I love the idea of the character, so I that'd be fun. It'd be a nice probably one-off.
Well, I think some were longer than others. There's a lot of like short stories, but I think there are some like novels. Like I think Hound of the Baskervilles, for example, is like a full-length novel.
Yeah, we'd have to definitely look into it, but that could be a fun little, maybe one or two off kind of thing.
Yeah, I imagine it's like take probably just a couple of go through a couple of intervals to read it. But
yeah, that's the beauty of this is we have endless possibilities for things that we can cover, books that we can read, and it really is just nowhere to go but up.
Definitely. Yeah, there's some other things that I might maybe some other, later we could talk about, because I'm kind of getting some ideas together for what to read next time around. But I guess to get back to what we're reading this time around here, Leviathan Wakes. There's not too much else in terms of Miller. I think we got Miller pretty, and his plotline pretty covered. Like you said at the top here, not too much happened to him except kind of getting fired. That's basically the main thing that happened to him. But that we did learn a lot about him. I really just the last thought here. I really enjoyed, like you mentioned before, that this sort of like, I thought it was a very good depiction of like someone whose life is just kind of crashing down around him, and he's just having this big realization about himself, Yeah. And he's like, "Oh crap! I'm not the superstar detective that I once was and thought I was. I'm the guy who's a joke, And I think they did a really good job depicting that.
Yeah, which one thing I think we should definitely touch on before moving on to Holden is the interaction he had with, is it Hassini? Is that the name of the bartender? What's it called, the Blue Frog?
That sounds right. I think so, yeah.
Yeah, forgive me if I'm remembering his name wrong. When he's suddenly realizing that he's there and just wasted out of his mind, and Hassini's just like, "Hey man, it's me. Let's get you home, man." And he asks about Julie, and Miller's like, "How do you know about her?" And he's just like, "You've been talking about her all night, man. Some girl you fall for?" And Miller makes the kind of realization, the revelation inside of himself that he says, "Yeah, I do love her," which I don't think it's supposed to be taken as a I'm in love with her, like I want to be with her kind of way. I personally took it as he's in love with the idea of Julie in the way that he has built her up in his mind, but not in a relationship, get married kind of way, but more in a bonding kind of way, like almost a spiritual or a like metaphysical kind of love, to where it's not about he sees her and she's like, "Oh, what a hot bod, I want to have sex with her" kind of way, but just almost like a kindred spirit. Like, I feel like she represents, or at least the way that he built her up in his mind, because I feel like the way he has kind of created her and the way that he talks to her in that almost inner monologue kind of way is not necessarily who she is. It's who she is as he understands her. And I feel like that person that he has built up in his mind is someone that's supposed to represent not just some person he's looking for, but in terms of like Julie Mao herself, but a person he's looking for in himself.
Well, I think it's the sense of like this paternalistic, although I don't necessarily mean that in a fully negative way, but he does have like a paternalistic view of Julie. You know, like he's like he sees himself kind of as like, in the way that he is choosing to carry out the case, he believes that he's kind of like protecting her in a way. Like he's trying to find her and figure out what the situation is, but he doesn't really. He also doesn't want to like hand her back over to her parents either, you know?
Yeah, I don't think he entirely knows what he would want to do if he did find her. I think he's just kind of has the sense of I have to protect you, I have to make sure that you're okay. But I don't think he knows what he wants to do if he actually achieves that goal.
Yeah, I think that's very apt.
All he knows is that he's not going to ship her back to her parents because he ain't no kidnapper.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's kind of his thing right there. He's not really, and that's kind of maybe also somewhat indicative of how he might have lost his edge, because he doesn't really know what he's doing at this point, you know?
Yeah. So, last thing about Miller. Now that he's been fired from Star Helix, he is no longer bound to a formerly Earth-controlled body. So, now what do you think? Do you think this is a means for him to possibly leave the station and continue his own personal investigation into her? Because he still has the I need to look and see, because the last thing he was really doing was trying to essentially find the Rocinante. He's trying to find it at this point after Dawes told him that Holden and the crew made it off of the Donnager. He's trying to find where they went and where they ended up, and he's getting so close. He's really narrowing it down really well, that I think that he might actually be able to find it. And I one thing I love about that is it does not feel like a kind of ass pull kind of way, to where he's just like, I need to find Holden and the crew. Oh, there they are. I guess I'll just go do that. The way that he's been trying to narrow it down actually makes sense to me, to the point to where this feels like a natural, like, detective work to figure out. Like, there's logic behind what he's doing, and it makes sense to me. So take that for what it will. But it feels like he's actually doing the work required to actually throw something at the wall and have a chance of something sticking.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think this book, I think owing in part to that sort of hard-boiled detective roots, that it does kind of, they do show that sort of like I guess not correct necessarily, but like the sort, like, it shows the work. It shows them actually doing, the process, doing the work to like resolve this. As to what's next, I think this could be a good opportunity for him for the stories to intersect, because if he's fired from his job, he has he's not necessarily bound to stay on the station. He can leave now. So, the stories can intersect. He can go look for Julie. He can go look for the crew of the night, and I guess now the Rocinante. I think this is a good way, I guess, from like a plot mechanic standpoint, to now free him up to join the other story, or join it at some point,
Yeah. So I think that works as a nice little segue to get over to Holden and the gang, who, when we left, were they at the Donnager, or were they on their way to the Donnager?
I think they had just talked to Johnson, and that's where we left them off. And then the next thing is what you were saying. I think the literal next sentence we see is the Donnager was ugly.
Yeah.
Like they were not very, and to be fair, the way they describe it is not. Yeah, literally first sentence of chapter 11. The Donnager was ugly.
Yeah. A skyscraper on its side.
Mm-hmm. Which I guess it kind of makes sense because they mention this too. They say that there's in space there's not as much like, well, the reason things are all curved on Earth is for aerodynamic purposes.
Yeah. Come through the atmosphere.
In space, you don't really have that. I mean, I'm sure there are. I know there's like clouds and stuff of radiation and of gases, but I don't know. I'm sure it's the. Yeah. I just don't think that it's nearly as big a concern. These kind of very like harsh and like austere and kind of ugly looking structures. In this case, their capital ship it's also very ugly and austere, and I think that is also kind of indicative of at least the way that they have portrayed the Martian Republic to this point. Is that it's kind of militaristic, kind of just very very hard edged,
Yeah, they do make the comment about how the edges are sharper on the ship compared to the Canterbury, and how everything is just polished to a sheen.
Oh, that is true. Yeah, it's there's like a lot of it's not just in the architecture. It's just the way things are. There's a lot of like it's just this idea of like this very hard edged culture, and you can see it in there the way that they communicate with the crew of the Knight at this point. So they land on the the Donnager, and there's a little bit of a back and forth, but it's pretty clear that they are being arrested in all but name. It's not really like they are being rescued per se. It very much feels like they are being detained. Like their worst fears may be coming to pass.
Yeah, but we don't necessarily get to that point because they're put in their room, which is ostensibly a very well pampered holding cell for all intents and purposes. But Holden has his, I don't want to call it an interrogation, but I think that was what it was supposed to be. It never really got to that point with Lieutenant Kelly, who I think is a great character, by the way. I really liked Kelly.
I thought Kelly was interesting.
Yeah. Which, man, you gotta love some of the creative things that authors can come up with a futuristic sci-fi setting. That focus lozenge is one of the weirdest things I've ever read for future tech, and it's also really cool at the same time. You suck on a lozenge, and your eyes dilate, and you're now hyper focused, and it's like, yeah, lie to me, see what happens.
Yeah, it's Adderall in a chewable form.
Yeah, but I got a really strong idea of what kind of person Kelly was just from that interview, even though we didn't get the full thing. Because, yeah, he's very much a Martian Marine. He's very, very strict to that code of life, it seems like. But he also doesn't seem like the kind of person that can't see the forest for the trees. Like he knows what things are really like. He's not kind of stuck in that jarhead mentality,
Yeah, I think he's definitely. They do kind of. I think they do try to delineate him as having like a certain. He may be in the military, but he has like a very. I think he might have had other training like outside of the military, because I think he has a more well-rounded view of the world, you know. And I think he's not necessarily. I don't know. He's kind of caught in between like his desire to like figure out like the truth and like try to feeling out like, are these guys like, is this like an OPA operation from his perspective? You know, he's trying to see if that's, because that's one thing he I noticed he asked them a lot, is like trying to suss out any kind of like OPA sympathies on the part of Holden and his crew.
Yeah, and there is that bit with, what was her name? Was it Yao?
Yeah, that was Yao.
Yeah, and she's like, hey, those 6 ships that are following you, you might want to tell them to back off because we're gonna shoot them in an hour.
Yeah, that was interesting too. Is like this very that's kind of like where you're saying there's a very harsh kind of like the culture is like, okay, we're just getting ready to destroy them. We don't really even know where they're at. Even within an hour, they're not going to necessarily be like close enough to board. But it's like this, they're like preemptively in a very more aggressive posture. It actually, but in this case, while I would probably regard that as a negative in most cases, they actually turn out to be right here, at least to some extent, because those 6 craft, they start to attack the Donnager, and have an astonishing amount of success. I didn't. How big did those 6 craft? Did you imagine them to be? I did not imagine them to be very big at all. In fact, I imagined them to be quite small relative to the Donnager.
Yeah, my guess would have been like maybe a dozen people, maybe 20 at most, crewing a ship size, like that kind of size.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, but not only do they attack the Donnager, and they are able to do significant damage to it using their weaponry, including, I think, it's not made entirely clear, but I think the shell, I guess it was fired from some kind of railgun, that killed Shed actually did come from one of the 6 craft, and again, this is very similar to what we saw in the Julie Mao prologue, I guess. They play very cagey with descriptions of the craft, and as we see later, as they begin to board the ship, they don't really do a lot of describing of the boarders.
Yeah, it's very just like, oh, they're wearing these enviro suits and they have these weapons, and ooh, they mean business.
And this could end up being like a totally just crackpot, nothing theory that's just totally wrong. But there is a part of me that believes that these are not like, they are not human.
Really?
And yeah, here's where I come in with that. It's like, do you remember back in the Julie Mao chapter, like that weird fleshy mass that covered the engine?
Yeah.
Theoretically, maybe there's some sort of like weird bio weapon, that's what it is, and that it did that to them. But we don't ever hear them talk at any point. Also, including in the Julie Mao section, and I don't know. That's just kind of what I don't know. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe I'm totally off the mark here. But part of me is wondering if this is just like they've kind of, this was just both Mars and Earth kind of getting caught in this. I don't know. This might just be some sort of extra galactic entity. Anyway, I think it's too soon necessarily to to call it one way or the other, but I do think it's interesting that they never. It's either really bad writing, to not describe them in any way, or to give such minimal description, or it's really good writing, and it'll set us up for a big impact later.
Yeah, I will say, initially, with the whole Canterbury and Scopuli situation, I was of the opinion of this very much could be Mars doing some sort of sleeper hit kind of thing, where they have some sort of plausible deniability, but they are trying to make a move on the belt. I wasn't convinced, but I thought that was definitely a possibility. I also thought it could have been some third party that's trying to stir some shit up and really flare the fires of war. Now I'm of the opinion that it's absolutely that. It was not a Belter crew. It wasn't necessarily the OPA as we understand it through the means of Dawes and Johnson. And I don't think it was Mars either. I think it's a third party that intentionally used a Mars battery so that they could have that seed be sowed. And now they also are... Once they've turned the Belters against Mars through the Scopuli and the Canterbury, we now have them taking out the Donnager, which now has Mars have a reason for more than just defensive hostility against the belt. Now we're looking at complete and total open warfare.
Yeah, I think that's possible, that it's some sort of like either a different group or like some sort of like OPA kind of like maximalist, accelerationist kind of group that are trying to spark the conflict. That they did kind of frame Mars as like create the, to a certain extent, the Scopuli was some sort of like false flag kind of thing to kind of, like you're saying, to inflame tensions. That I think that's probably more likely than it being extraterrestrial, but it's just that weird flesh covering the engine with the head of the captain still being alive and attached to it. That's just really stuck in my mind a lot. So that's why I think what you're saying is more likely, but I'm just not fully like willing to go there yet. Like I'm still entertaining other possibilities, but I do think that's probably the most likely reality here.
Well, I don't think our ideas have to be mutually exclusive. Like I'm saying, I think it's a third party that's sowing some seeds of distress and doubt on both sides, and it's still possible that it could be extraterrestrial.
And there's one complicating factor here that I can kind of think of. That's kind of an interesting thought. Is like, so, but how did Julie's parents? How did they know what was going to happen then? Because, or is that just a coincidence?
I don't think it's a coincidence.
I don't think it is either. But I think that's like, it's just like, so how do they tie into what's going on? I think in that place, or in that way, there's still a lot more questions than answers. But anyway, so the attack is going on, and their Shed's head is blown off by this railgun shell charge bullet. I don't know. And it pierces their containment cell, but in that moment they start to depressurize as the atmosphere starts to get sucked out of the cell and into space. So they're able to quickly cobble together like a thing to seal it, like a temporary like seal using like a binder
and a plastic tray or something.
Yeah. And that's when we kind of get that's kind of how their story kind of escalates, because at that point they're like, oh shoot, are we dead? Is there any way we could get out? And at that point the Mars Marines they arrive at the door, and they get them out. And this is the part where we find out that not only are these ships, did they do that, they boarded the Donnager, and not only did they board, they're winning pretty handily. Like they're just tearing through the Mars defenders.
So yeah, they were essentially rescued from their room by the one and only Lieutenant Kelly and his Marine band. But yeah, so they're trying to. His plan is they need to get off the Donnager because he understands that the ship's lost. So that they have a ship in the hold that they can use to escape and get out soon enough and quickly enough to where they should be able to evade any of the 6 ships pursuing. And yeah, it costs literally all of the Marines' lives, but they make it to the ship called the Tachi and get out. And then the Donnager blows up.
Yeah, that was pretty. It was a pretty kind of fun sequence. They're getting through the corridors and they're in a shootout with the boarders. There's some kind of interesting moments in there, but Holden, he kind of has like these sort of derealization moments where he's like, I guess the extremity of his experience is overwhelming to him at this point, and he's like not. I don't know. He's like everything just feels so distant, so far away. He's like
a disassociation.
He feels like he's dissociating. That's probably the best way to put it. So he's kind of going through a lot of it. I think it's just sort of a sense of exhaustion, and as he's leaving, that when the combat kicks off, he kind of snaps into it a little bit more. But I think he's pretty. We kind of see his character kind of get worn down, and so they get to the ship. It's the classic trope. They keep going. They get into one situation, and one of the Marines, like they either stay behind to cover the exit, or they just die. Classic trope. So and they get on board the ship, and Lieutenant Kelly actually boards with them for a little bit, and he's been wounded, and he's kind of upset about that. They try to offer to help him, and he just kind of brushes them off.
As opposed to him being excited about being wounded.
He really ought to be. He honestly he should be ecstatic that he's alive. And
hell yeah, I've been wounded critically in my chest. Wee-haw!
Well, here's the thing. This is where I kind of differ in my interpretation of the events than the characters. The characters kind of feel bad for the Marines, and they feel bad for Kelly, and they're like, wow, they sacrificed their lives to save us. But I don't really think that's what happened. I think that they were assigned a mission, the Marines, and they were trying to extract them as a intelligence asset to be debriefed somewhere else. I don't think that they were like trying to save them just to save them. I think that they were trying to hold on to them and try to they weren't going to just let them go like the way that they end ultimately after Kelly dies and they're flying off. They're like, so what do we do? I guess we're just gonna fly around now, and then they come up with the idea to meet up with the OPA. But I don't think that was even close to being on the table had the Marines, had even just Lieutenant Kelly lived. So
yeah.
That's a little bit of me like, okay, guys, I think you're kind of missing the point here. Like they didn't sacrifice their lives for you. They sacrificed their lives for your value to Mars. If that makes sense.
And they said that because Kelly ends up dying because when they hit the 12G speed that Alex thrusts them out of when they escape the Donnager, his broken ribs puncture his organs and he dies that way. And I think it's really funny. They're all saying, well, he clearly knew what was going to happen when he told me to do this, so he knew that he was going to die doing this. He died saving us, essentially. And my thought process was, did he really, though? Like, do you really think that he was just like, all right, kid, punch it. I'm going to die doing this, but you know what? Semper Fi, motherfuckers. Like, I don't think that was what was going through his head. I think what he was saying was, get us out of here quickly. And I think he had every intention of surviving the escape and having to deal with getting patched up later, but Alex put his foot down a little too hard and killed him for it, which I think is just really funny.
That was kind of amusing when you put it that way. It's just it's in a kind of like black humor kind of way. But yeah, I agree. I don't really agree with Holden and the characters and their weird over gratitude towards their captors. But I guess that's neither here nor there, because their captors are dead. Because as they're flying off, eventually, and this is something that they kind of touch on a little bit, there's like some sort of technology on like in the command center and in some different sectors that absolutely cannot fall into enemy hands. And so to that end, they're like, okay, if the enemy breaches beyond a certain point, the other parts of the ship, they have switches in them that they can flip and just self-destruct. And so that's what happens. So the Donnager blows up, and as far as we know, takes all of the boarders and their craft out with them. So at this point, they seem to be home free. Alex, in a very slick move, disables the tracking transponder as they're leaving. That was a cool moment.
Yeah.
And then so they're free. The Mars can't find them. Nobody can find them unless they have to make that call. And so they're kind of confused. They're like, okay, so what do we do exactly? Where do we go from here? And they remember their call from our boy Fred, who's like, okay, wow, that was a lot, guys. That was pretty heavy. Why don't you just come down to Tycho Station and we'll kind of figure this out?
Yeah.
And so they head out to Tycho Station, and along the way, they figure out some way to like spoof the transponder fake.
Yeah,
Fred it's not really important, but go ahead.
Yeah, Fred sends them essentially a pirated transponder sequence that they can replace the Martian one with, so that they don't appear to be a Martian vessel.
Yeah, how to jailbreak your iPhone or something like that.
Yeah.
they
how to jailbreak your Martian Navy battle cruiser.
So they jailbreak the battle cruiser or whatever, and then as they're flying there,
it's a Corvette. It's a battle Corvette.
Yeah. Okay, well I wouldn't have. I couldn't tell you the difference.
You think Alex puts the top down?
Yeah, he puts the top down, and then immediately all the air is sucked out of their lungs.
That joke has totally never been made before. I guarantee it.
As they're cruising in their Corvette out to Tycho Station, we're starting to get some vibes from Holden and Naomi. My current favorite character, Naomi. There's kind of like this burgeoning will they won't they kind of situation cropping up. There's not really too much to dig into there. I mean, there's like this little, other than just he's kind of like looking at her and he's like, wow, yeah, she's actually kind of attractive. And then later, like kind of like a little bit of like playful banter at a karaoke bar.
He's like, girl, when'd you get so hot?
The scales have fallen from his eyes, I guess. I guess he's moved on from Ade now. But I think it's.
I don't think it's. I do feel like part of it is him coping with Ade's death. Like, he's now seeing Naomi in a new light, not in the sense of, the classic Austin Powers, wait a tick, that means I'm single again. Like, I don't think it's supposed to be taken like that, but I think that's one of his ways of coping with the PTSD of everything that's happened, is he's looking for some form of companionship, and he's thinking he might find it with Naomi.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what they want. They would want you to feel from this interaction, and there's maybe something to the fact that they're also have both gone through a very several extreme situations in close proximity to one another, both in terms of like their actual proximity and in terms of like a lot of these things are happening over a relatively short time period.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a bonding through crisis kind of thing. At least maybe on his end. I don't know if it's being reciprocated by her yet, but I mean, we'll see.
Yeah. That remains to be seen. That is at this point unclear.
Yeah. Which probably one of the biggest moments with the trip to Tycho Station is after him and Naomi have a little moment about the transponder and him showing why he's the captain now. He renames the ship to the Rocinante, which I had to look up. I don't know if you did or not, or if you already knew. So, for anyone who doesn't know, which was me until like 2 hours ago, the Rocinante is the name of Don Quixote's horse, which translates to, according to the internet, so don't take this as pure fact unless, Daniel, you can back me up on this, which translates to old hag.
I actually didn't know. That's kind of... I wasn't aware of that. I guess it's kind of I was aware that it was an allusion to Don Quixote's horse, but I didn't. I guess I didn't know that it meant old hag.
Yeah, I think that's kind of funny, and I've never read Don Quixote, but I do, from the bare bones knowledge I do know of what Don Quixote is. It does feel pretty apt to name their ship after his horse.
I would say that they are currently on a very quixotic quest. Yes, so I feel it is pretty apt.
Yeah, which I will say the Rocinante is an awesome ship, and I would love to be on it. There are so many really cool amenities on it that just, man, going from the Knight to the Rocinante is one hell of an upgrade.
Yeah, they mentioned some things like that we get what is about as close to a George R.R. Martin food moment when they're eating like the flatbread with like the hummus. So, but they've been like up to this point eating a bunch of like essentially protein bars. So they're obviously the fact that they're eating real food makes a really big impression on all of the characters, and it's like this nice moment where it's kind of like relieving tension somewhat, where they feel they're like oh wow, we can get a shower, we can eat real food, it's just it's a nice moment to kind of decrease the tension after what we've seen to this point.
Yeah. And so to kind of round out Holden and the crew's story so far, they arrive on Tycho Station. They meet up with Fred, and they're very cagey toward him because Holden's whole thing moving forward is if anybody wants to tell us what to do, they're gonna be on the receiving end of either the ship's cannons or my pistol. So it's very much a we're not taking shit from anyone anymore kind of stance that him and the crew have taken. And so they kind of show that to Fred when they get to Tycho Station. And Fred is like, all right, well, you're here for a reason. And Holden's like, yeah, there's got to be some sort of you want us for something. You wouldn't just do this out of the goodness of your heart. Why are we here? Why do you want us here? And Fred basically explains that, yeah, this war can only end two ways. One of which is human annihilation, ostensibly, and he goes into the whole thing with like the Einstein quote, and the other thing is find out who actually destroyed the Canterbury, put them on trial, hold them accountable, and show that this was not something that was worth causing this war, and we end it that way. And I need you guys, because you're the only people that were at the Canterbury and the Donnager, I need you guys as star witnesses. So yeah, I'll put you up, I'll protect you, but I'm going to need that from you in return, and this is going to help me further my political career as well. So, there you go.
Yeah, it's a very I think we'll see how this goes, but I think generally speaking, the OPA come off as the most reasonable that we've seen, at least to this point. I mean, who knows? Maybe things will be different as the story kind of progresses. But they like between Dawes and now with Fred, they're doing they have like a very a lot of the time when they've been speaking at this point is they say things in a very reasonable, they have very reasonable goals and very reasonable ways to go about things. So like they said, having some sort of like trial would be infinitely more beneficial to just like having like going to all out war between the Belt and Mars. So I don't know. I think in general, I think that this seems to be a good turn, but we still have like roughly 300-ish pages of the book to go, so we're not even halfway. So I guess we'll see how this all shakes out. But I mean, to this point, I would say of all of the entities that we've run across, the OPA seems to be one of the more reasonable ones.
Well, there is a quote that is well known in certain circles that goes a bit along the lines of, "The enemy speaks kindly and wields a knife."
That's kind of that's kind of what I'm getting at too. Is like we don't know. Like there's probably gonna be some sort of like, based just on the vibes I'm getting through the book so far, there's gonna be some sort of like really nihilistic heel turn by the OPA, and the author is going to use it to kind of make this point of like, oh, everyone's bad, you can only trust yourself, or something like that. I kind of get that vibe from these authors, which is not really something I personally agree with, and maybe that they don't even go there either. That remains to be seen. But that it just feels like they're almost suspicious. Yeah, what I'm getting at is they're almost suspiciously reasonable in this. So it's like, okay, so where does the catch come in?
Well, I will say something that has been done really well across both Holden and Miller's storyline is we get this view of Mars and the OPA in a more kind of human light, because with Holden's story, up until him making it to Fred, the OPA is being framed as these radical revolutionists that are anarchistic and a blight against Mars and all that is good. But we also see the Martians as actual people that are being put in a situation that they don't want to be in, but they're having to deal with as best as they can. And it does not seem like they're warmongers, at least in the way that they are made out to be in Miller's storyline. And with Dawes, we're seeing that the OPA is more than just that anarchistic entity that just wants to overthrow and take control, that there's a lot more nuance to them, that they are just trying to, at least this sect of them, because it does seem like there might be different factions in the OPA that want different things, and there might be tension building towards an OPA civil war later on down the line because of that. But at least with the faction that we see through Dawes and Fred, is that they are just trying to look out for the people that they think matter to them and don't want any. They're essentially, this might be a little too much of a stretch, but it's almost like the American colonies in the 18th century with the Revolutionary War, but not quite so hostile, at least at first. It's more of like a we just want to have what's ours and be left alone kind of thing.
Well, that's some people would probably argue that's how the American Revolution at least began. It was like the idea of at first was they were there like we just want to assert our rights as Englishmen, and I think in a lot of senses, in a lot of kind of like revolutionary periods, that's at least how things will start. It's like this idea of like things are not going well, things are not, this is not really a fair situation, and but we want to work, we want to say, or there's it's not starting at 10, it's not starting at open warfare, it's starting at like, hey, this is not really fair, this actually isn't even within the currently existing legal framework. that kind of thing. That seems to be kind of where it's starting, and then who knows? Maybe as things, kind of progress, like as the fallout from the Donnager incident kind of unravels, maybe we'll start to see it start to ramp up.
Yeah. Well, I guess just to kind of round my point off, I feel like it's done a good job of showing both sides of the conflict as being humans and not just one evil entity or one good entity. And it does make me feel stronger about the idea that all of this is being caused by a third party behind the scenes that's trying to create this war where there wouldn't have been naturally. So I don't know. I guess it's not a black and white issue at the end of the day, and I think it's doing a great job of showing that. So I don't know. It's just one of those things to where I feel like we've gotten some really good setup. We've gotten some great establishment of the world and the conflict and the kind of political and socioeconomic ecosystem. And now we're just watching the pieces fall into place and just wondering where they're going to land.
Yeah. In some ways, I don't know. We might even want to look back later and see, and it may be the Canterbury is the inciting incident, or it may be the Donnager is the inciting incident. I don't know. It just kind of remains to be seen how this kind of all plays out. But I don't know. It's pretty interesting, and I look forward to seeing where this all goes.
Yeah, this book is one hell of a page turner.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's pretty well written. It's very like you said, good world building, good plot. I'm interested to play this out and kind of see where we end up.
Yeah, and if all goes well, there are 8 more books in the series.
Wow. That is a lot. That is more than I was expecting.
Yeah, I've heard it's all really good, and I've heard it ends really well. So, I don't necessarily think it's something that we have to cover. Like maybe in a year or so we look back and it's like, hey, we've read the next 2 or 3 books. Let's talk about that for a little bit. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily think it's a series that we need to cover start to finish here, at least in the same format that we're doing with this one. But as it stands, I think that I'm going to eventually make my way through the entire series. I don't know when. It could be a couple more years before I'm done, but I don't know. It's really good. I'm having a great time with this book.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I'm enjoying it too. Well, I guess I think that'll about get us this time.
Yeah.
So
So much for cutting down the time of the episodes.
Well, I think this maybe could edit out to being maybe a little bit shorter than we think, but it's so funny. Every episode that we begin with, where I'm saying beforehand, yeah, I don't know, not a lot really happened. Maybe there might not be much to talk about. We always end up to stretching these into being very, very lengthy.
Yeah. Well, like I said, there was a lot going on with the characters, even if there wasn't a lot going on with the overarching plot as a whole. But I feel like these characters are so well fleshed out and so interesting that we can talk about 100 pages worth of character development over a 2-hour span of time.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a sign of great writing.
Yeah, it is. I gotta hand it to. There's I think they're both talented, and as a team, I think Leviathan Wakes is a work to be proud of.
Yeah.
But I think that'll about get us for today. So thanks for listening. This is Sad Boys Book Club, and we will see you next time.
Yep. Have a good week.